Chapter 14. Friends and Enemies. Faced with worldwide overproduction, collapsing prices, and the Depression, Yergin writes, the major companies sought concordat rather than conquest. The Achilles as-is agreement of 1928 and its successors, pushed on by a British government that quietly preferred combination. But these cartel arrangements were repeatedly washed away by uncontrollable production and by the era's greatest threat, rising economic nationalism, which culminated in Mexico's expropriation of 1938. In August 1928, Duterte rented Achilles Castle in the Scottish Highlands, ostensibly for grouse shooting. In fact, it was a peace conference, prompted by his own global price war against Standard of New York over Russian oil. His guests, Teagle of Jersey, Sir John Cadman of Anglo-Persian, William Mellon of Gulf, Colonel Stewart of Indiana, hammered out a 17-page document known as the Achilles, or as-is, agreement. Each company would keep its existing share of each market. Volumes could grow only with total demand. Costs would be shared, and prices everywhere would be figured as if the oil came from the American Gulf Coast, plus freight from that coast, a formula that eliminated price competition among the members and yielded them extra profit. Behind the scenes, London encouraged collaboration, judging combination the cheapest course. Sir John Cadman, a coal mine manager turned professor who had coined the very phrase petroleum engineering, once denounced as a freak title, and now chairman of Anglo-Persian, embodied this quiet partnership. As one Treasury and Admiralty memorandum put it, the direct interests of the British government in oil matters were best kept out of sight, and experience showed that the amalgamation of oil interests has not resulted in the consumer suffering. But the agreement leaked at every seam. Fringe players undercut the majors. American exports, East Texas oil, and Romanian oil washed the arrangement away. The Big Three revised it again and again through the 1930s. A memorandum for European markets, then heads of agreement managed by committees in New York and London, even cutting advertising, road signs, and premiums to racing drivers in the name of economy and competitive expenditure. Cadman told the American Petroleum Institute that as-is was the keystone of cooperation in international petroleum trading outside the United States, adding, "It is still raining outside." The companies called one another friends, though it was, Yergin says, a sense of desperation rather than friendship. Even as they cooperated, they plotted, one Jersey executive urging that now is the best time to fight the Royal Dutch, as they are most vulnerable in the Far East. The structure finally lapsed with the outbreak of war in 1939. Meanwhile, one observer said, European oil operations were 90% political and 10% oil. Its deeper purpose had been to defend against political forces, and there, nationalism proved unstoppable. Governments imposed quotas, price controls, currency restrictions, and alcohol blending mandates. "We are now confronted," said a Jersey vice president, "with nationalistic policies in almost all foreign countries." In Persia, at the very bottom of the Depression, Reza Shah, the former Cossack officer who had crowned himself and broken the mullahs, abruptly canceled the Anglo-Persian concession in November 1932, the thunderbolt that no one had really believed, which threatened the company's very existence. Cadman flew to Tehran, and at deadlock, had his pilot taxi the plane visibly outside the Shah's windows. He salvaged a new agreement in April 1933, reduced in area, but with guaranteed payments, and extended from 1961 to 1993, confessing, "I felt that we had been pretty well plucked." The greatest challenge came in Mexico, where President Lázaro Cárdenas, a leftist land reformer with the long, mask-like face of the Indian, who resented companies that treated his country as, quote, conquered territory, faced an oil workers' strike the companies refused to settle. Jersey preferred, in its own words, to lose everything rather than acquiesce in a partnership which might be regarded as a partial expropriation. On the night of March 18, 1938, at 9:45, Cárdenas signed the expropriation order, greeted by a 6-hour parade of celebration. The United States, under the good neighbor policy, offered little support. One ambassador told Roosevelt there was no sense defending a status as dead as Julius Caesar. The state company Pemex was born, and Mexico, Yergin concludes, had established a model for the future. Chapter 15. The Arabian Concessions, the World that Frank Holmes Made. Against the near-unanimous verdict of the world's geologists that Arabia was oil dry, Yergin writes, the obsessive vision of a single promoter, Major Frank Holmes, whom the Arabs called Abu al-Naft, the father of oil, opened the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf. Holmes was a wandering New Zealand mining engineer with, in Yergin's phrase, a bluff, breezy, blustering, buccaneering way. On a wartime beef-buying trip to Abyssinia, he first heard of Arabian oil seepages. Afterward, through his Eastern and General Syndicate, he chased concessions across the peninsula, on Bahrain, in Al-Hassa, in the neutral zone. The geologists were contemptuous. Cadman said the reports leave little room for optimism, and one company director called Saudi Arabia devoid of all prospects, and touted Albania instead. Holmes, it was said, was the worst nuisance in London. People ran when they saw him coming. The breakthrough came on the island of Bahrain. Gulf Oil took Holmes's Arabian rights, but having joined the Turkish Petroleum Company, was bound by the Red Line Agreement and had to pass Bahrain to Standard of California, which was not a member, and therefore free to act. After nasty negotiations over Britain's British Nationality Clause, which barred American development, Standard of California, operating through a Canadian-registered subsidiary, drilled and on May 31, 1932, struck oil. Petroleum, Yergin writes, had been discovered in the Arab world, and Bahrain lay only 20 miles from the Saudi mainland, with seemingly identical geology. The central figure was Ibn Saud Abdulaziz al-Saud, just over 50, 6'3", and barrel-chested, the warrior king who had retaken Riyadh by night as a young man, subdued the fanatical Ikhwan Brotherhood, who condemned the telephone and the motorcar as tools of the devil, forged the kingdom he renamed Saudi Arabia in 1932, and then, when the Depression cut the flow of Mecca pilgrims that was his main revenue, found himself desperate for money, his officials months in arrears. His eccentric British advisor, the convert Harry St. John Philby, father of the future Soviet spy Kim Philby, told him he was like folk asleep on buried treasure. "If anyone would offer me £1 million, the king said, I would give him all the concessions he wanted." A bidding contest developed between Standard of California and the British-led Iraq Petroleum Company, whose representative, bound by the Red Line, and judging that his company did not need any more oil, seeking only to keep out all competitors, withdrew, telling the Americans, "You might just as well pack up. The Americans are far and away higher. Put your trust in God and sign," the king told his finance minister. The agreement of May 29, 1933, brought £35,000, $175,000, in gold up front, shipped as sovereigns in 7 boxes, for a 60-year concession over some 360,000 square miles. Philby, it turned out, was secretly on Standard's payroll even as he advised the king, and the money helped send his son Kim to Cambridge, where the younger Philby, quote, took the first steps on the way to becoming a Soviet spy. Kuwait followed after a decade of maneuvering, its Sheikh Ahmad playing Britain, Iraq, and Ibn Saud against one another, his pearl economy devastated by the Japanese invention of the cultured pearl. "It was a stab to my heart," he told Holmes, "when I observed the oil work at Bahrain and nothing here. Yes, I have now 2 bidders," he later observed of Anglo-Persian and Gulf, "and from the point of view of a seller that is all to the good." Cadman, sure there was no Kuwaiti oil worth having, had declared, "The Americans are welcome to what they can find there." Rather than a ruinous bidding war, the 2 rivals formed the jointly owned Kuwait Oil Company in 1934. The negotiators, Holmes and an Anglo-Persian man, were dubbed the Heavenly Twins. Then discovery came in a rush. Kuwait's Bergen field in February 1938. Its test oil so hot it turned the sand walls to glass. And, in Saudi Arabia, in March 1938, the Great Strike at Dammam Well No. 7, nearly 3 years after the discouraging first well. Ibn Saud and Saudi Arabia, Yergin writes, were on the road to fortune. The Axis powers vied for concessions. Japan even offered samurai armor, too small for the king. But the American company exercised its rights and expanded to 440,000 square miles, and in 1939 Ibn Saud himself, amid a procession of 400 cars, turned the valve on the first tanker cargo. Then the Second World War intervened. Italy bombed the coast, wells were plugged with cement against the enemy, and the vast reserves became the object of intense post-war power plays. Asked how he had been so certain against all the experts, Holmes tapped his nose. "This was my geologist." Chapter 16. Japan's Road to War. Japan's near-total dependence on imported oil, Yergin argues, drove its imperial expansion and set it on a collision course with the United States. Oil was at once the motive for Japanese aggression and the linchpin that forced the confrontation. Petroleum was only about 7% of Japan's energy, but it was strategically vital for the fleet and the merchant marine, and by the late 1930s, Japan produced only about 7% of what it consumed. The rest was imported, some 80% of it from the United States and 10% from the Dutch East Indies. The domestic market was dominated by two Western firms, and a 1934 law gave the government control over imports, quotas, and prices. When the heads of Shell and Standard suggested to Washington the idea of frightening Japan with an embargo, the Secretary of State refused. The drift to war ran through Manchuria, seized in 1931 in a staged railway incident and called Japan's Lifeline, through what was called government by assassination and the dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, through the doctrine of advance to the south, and through the full-scale war with China that erupted at the Marco Polo Bridge in July 1937, milestones in the history of aerial terror, a journalist called the bombing of Chongqing. Washington moved cautiously, first a moral embargo, then restrictions. In July 1940, it banned aviation gasoline of the highest octane, but Japan simply bought vast quantities of slightly lower-grade fuel and needled it with lead additives, buying, in one stretch, 550% more of the lower grade. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, scrap iron exports having already been cut off, and the American fleet was moved from California to Pearl Harbor. The war minister, Hideki Tojo, nicknamed the Razor, pushed for confrontation. Behind quiet diplomatic conversations in Washington, where the code-breaking effort called Magic was already reading Japan's most secret purple diplomatic messages, and the ambassador, Admiral Nomura, met the Secretary of State perhaps 40 or 50 times. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and read biographies of Lincoln and doubted a war with America could be won, planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. "It's out of the question," he said. "To fight the United States is like fighting the whole world. But it has been decided, so I will do my best. Doubtless I will die." The decisive squeeze came in the summer of 1941. After Japan moved into Indochina, the United States, on July 25th, froze Japanese assets, and Dean Acheson turned the freeze into a de facto total oil embargo. "Whether or not we had a policy," he said, "we had a state of affairs." Japan's Admiral Nagano warned that reserves would last no more than 2 years. The foreign minister declared that the empire, to save its very life, must take measures to secure the raw materials of the South Seas, break asunder this ever-strengthening chain of encirclement. The Lord Privy Seal said oil had reduced the whole problem to a very simple factor. At an imperial conference in September, the emperor read a poem of his grandfather's pleading for peace, and challenged the army's optimistic 3-month estimate. But Prince Kanoye fell. Tojo became prime minister on October 18th, and at a November conference, Tojo warned, 2 years from now, we will have no petroleum for military use. A historian later wrote that the oil factor hovered over the conference table like a demon. On November 26th, the American Secretary of State sent a note demanding withdrawal from China. That same day, the Japanese task force sailed from the Kuril Islands for Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, the bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor at 5 to 8 in the morning, sinking 8 battleships and killing more than 2,300 servicemen, while the American carriers, by chance, were at sea. Yet the Japanese commander declined a third wave against the repair yards and the oil tanks, what Yergin calls the one mistake. As Admiral Nimitz later said, there were 4.5 million barrels of oil stored there, all of it vulnerable, and had the Japanese destroyed it, it would have prolonged the war another 2 years. The true prize of the whole campaign remained the oil fields of the East Indies. Chapter 17. Germany's Formula for War. Germany, Yergin writes, lacking domestic oil. Coal supplied 90% of its energy, built its war strategy on synthetic fuels and the capture of foreign oil fields, and in the end, ran short of oil in their quest for oil. The story begins in June 1932, when 2 officials of the chemical giant IG Farben met Hitler in Munich. The scheduled half-hour meeting ran 2.5 hours. An economy without oil, Hitler told them, is inconceivable in a Germany which wishes to remain politically independent. He embraced synthetic fuel made from coal by the hydrogenation process, invented by Friedrich Bergius, a technology in which Standard of New Jersey had also invested after its research chief visited the Leuna plant and wired Tegel that it meant the independence of Europe in the matter of gasoline supply. Once in power, Hitler launched the Autobahns and the Volkswagen. By 1940, synthetic fuel supplied 46% of Germany's oil and about 95% of its aviation gasoline. The Blitzkrieg was designed to win quickly, before the oil ran out. Two lessons had shaped German thinking. Mussolini later told Hitler that oil sanctions during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia would have forced him to withdraw within a week, and the Soviets abruptly cut oil deliveries in early 1936. That February, Hitler announced Germany had effectively solved the problem of producing synthetic gasoline, a matter of political significance, and the next month remilitarized the Rhineland, an act he called the most nerve-wracking of his life. His four-year plan held that the production cost of these raw materials was of no importance. Oil then shaped his most fateful decision, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler's obsession, Yergin writes, was oil, above all the fields of Baku and the Caucasus and the black earth of the Ukraine. Albert Speer, interrogated in 1945, confirmed that the need for oil certainly was a prime motive. But the vast distances and the fuel demands of 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and 625,000 horses outran the supply. The vehicles burned twice the anticipated fuel on the terrible roads. "My generals," Hitler complained, "know nothing about the economic aspects of war. The Volga will be our Mississippi." At Stalingrad, as the Sixth Army was trapped with fuel for only 20 miles when it needed 30, Hitler told a general, "Unless we get the Baku oil, the war is lost." The Great Southern Offensive of 1942, Operation Blau, aimed at the Caucasus fields, but reached only the minor field at Maikop, which the Russians had wrecked, yielding at first just 70 barrels a day. The irony of Operation Blau, Yergin writes, was that the Germans ran short of oil in their quest for oil. Their gasoline panzers could not even burn the diesel of captured Russian tanks, and fuel was sometimes carried forward by camel. Stalingrad became Germany's first great defeat. In North Africa, Rommel, the master of mobility whose transport was largely captured British and American vehicles, complained that our moves would be decided more by the petrol gauge than by tactical requirements, and after the defeat at El Alamein, where the Allies, reading his codes, sank his fuel ships, lamented, "The British were able to hit us in a part of our machine on whose proper functioning the whole of the rest depended. Shortage of petrol, it's enough to make one weep." His epitaph on the whole campaign, "The battle is fought and decided by the quartermasters before the shooting begins." Meanwhile, I.G. Farben built a vast synthetic fuel plant beside Auschwitz, worked by slave labor paid to the SS by the head, and fed some 1,000 calories a day. By 1944, a third of the synthetic fuel workforce was slave labor. The survivor Primo Levi, prisoner number 174-517, wrote that the only things alive are machines and slaves, and the former are more alive than the latter. The decisive blow came from the air. In March 1944, the American air commander Carl Spaatz proposed to Eisenhower that the synthetic fuel plants be made the primary target. On May 12, 1944, more than 900 bombers struck, hitting Leuna and the other plants. "I shall never forget the date May 12th, Speer wrote. The technological war was decided. The June directive made denying oil to the enemy the primary strategic aim. Synthetic output by hydrogenation fell from around 90,000 barrels a day before the raids to 5,000 by September, aviation gasoline to a mere 3,000. The Luftwaffe's fighter general Adolf Galland called it the fatal blow, and jet fighters sat grounded for lack of fuel while the Russians captured Ploesti. In the final Blitzkrieg, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German tanks stalled for lack of fuel within about 1,000 feet of the largest Allied fuel dump in Europe, a colonel misled by out-of-date maps, and a wall of burning gasoline. By early 1945, aviation fuel production was a fraction of 1% of the previous years, and in Speer's last image of the Reich, 150 army trucks were dragged forward by teams of 4 oxen each. They had no fuel. Chapter 18. Japan's Achilles, Heel. Japan won the oil it had gone to war for, Yergin writes, rehabilitating the East Indies fields faster than expected. But its fatal weakness, in the words of the postwar American Strategic Bombing Survey, was the vulnerability of its shipping. The Battle of the Maris, waged by American submarines, severed the tanker lifeline between the captured southern oil fields and the barren home islands. The shortage of liquid fuel, Yergin writes, was Japan's Achilles heel. The chapter opens with the destruction of the great Shell refinery at Balikpapan in Borneo. Marcus Samuel's old jewel, blown up by its own staff as the Japanese advanced, the flames 150 feet high. 4 decades of industrial creation had been destroyed in less than a day. Of 75 people left behind, only 35 survived jungle, firing squads, and prison. Yet within months, Japan controlled the whole East Indies, having won all of Southeast Asia's resources in 3 months, and, victory drunk, it shipped some 4,000 oil workers south and rebuilt Southern Zone production to 3/4 of pre-war levels. It even used a captured American rig to drill its one wartime Wildcat and struck a supergiant field in Sumatra, the largest between California and the Middle East. The turning point came at Midway in June 1942, where American codebreakers helped sink 4 Japanese carriers. Yamamoto had said the first easy phase was a kind of children's hour, but now comes the adults' hour. Then the submarines did their work. Japan had entered the war with about 2 years' oil inventory, but its convoys, their noon positions betrayed by intercepted radio, were slaughtered. Some 86% of Japanese merchant shipping was ultimately sunk, most of it by American submariners who made up less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, yet caused more than half its losses. Oil imports peaked in early 1943 and, by early 1945, disappeared altogether. Synthetic fuel failed utterly, never reaching even 1/10 of its target, and much of that capacity sat useless in Manchuria. Fuel shortage then warped every battle. Before the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japan lost 273 planes to America's 29, its carriers took the direct route to save oil. At Leyte Gulf, the Admiral's order, there would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines, sent ships to destruction, and Admiral Kurita's force turned back within 40 miles of the invasion beaches, he said, because of shortage of fuel. The kamikaze, the Divine Wind suicide plane, was in part a fuel-saving weapon, since it cut the requirement in half. Pilot training was slashed to 30 hours, navigation training eliminated, and up to 40% of aircraft were lost merely in ferrying. American floating supply bases, by contrast, gave the U.S. fleet what Yergin calls long legs. A single base at Guam supplied 120,000 barrels of aviation gasoline a day, 6 times Japan's entire Air Force consumption of 21,000. The greatest battleship in the world, the Yamato, was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, for which 2,500 tons of fuel could barely be scraped together, and was sunk in April 1945. The end of the Imperial Navy. At home, Japan launched a desperate campaign to distill fuel from pine roots. 200 pine roots will keep a plane in the air for an hour, a scheme that would have required more than 1 million people a day and never produced usable aviation gasoline. When the war ended, hidden stocks of oil saved for suicide flights were discovered. The pine root gasoline later gummed up American Jeep engines. When MacArthur finally landed at Atsugi, his motorcade ran on charcoal for lack of gasoline, covering 20 miles in 2 hours. And when Tojo shot himself, it was easier, Yergin notes, to find an American doctor than an ambulance with fuel to reach him. The Pacific War had claimed upwards of 20 million lives. Chapter 19. The Allies' War. The Allies won the oil war, Yergin writes, through the mobilization of American production and the forging of a transatlantic supply system, but only after surviving the near-fatal U-boat campaign in the Battle of the Atlantic. The United States, responsible for almost 2/3 of world production, held roughly 1 million barrels a day of surplus capacity, an invaluable security margin, Yergin writes. Without it, the course of World War II might well have been different. Harold Ickes returned as the oil czar, the industry that had once detested him now working under his coordination, and Britain, having rejected a synthetic fuel strategy as too vulnerable to bombing, ran its whole downstream industry as a single wartime combine under one brand, Pool. Even the aging Detterding's flirtation with Hitler had passed, and the Nazis' bid to seize Royal Dutch/Shell had failed. The gravest danger was the Battle of the Atlantic. Churchill later called the U-boat peril the blackest cloud which we had to face, writing that he would willingly have exchanged a full-scale invasion for this shapeless, measureless peril expressed in charts, curves, and statistics. In July 1941, Britain had only 5 weeks of motor gasoline and 2 months of Navy fuel. In the first months of 1942, U-boats sank tankers off the American coast almost 4 times faster than they could be built, the ships silhouetted against the lights of undimmed cities, Miami the worst offender. Admiral Dönitz ordered his crews to rescue no one and take no one with you. The answers came slowly. The Big Inch and Little Inch pipelines carrying crude and products overland to the East Coast, which by late 1944 moved more than 40% of the supply. And, by the spring of 1943, the breaking of the U-boat codes, along with radar and long-range aircraft, which in 1 month sank 30% of the U-boats at sea and forced Dönitz to withdraw after what he called the greatest crisis in submarine warfare. Rationing reached the American public through what Yergin calls the side door of rubber. Since Japan's conquests had cut off 90% of natural rubber, Bernard Baruch's committee, including the presidents of Harvard and MIT, recommended a national 35-mile-an-hour speed limit and gasoline ration stickers, the coveted X sticker granting unlimited fuel and breeding a black market. "There's a war on," people said. Over the war, the Allies consumed almost 7 billion barrels of oil, 6 billion of them American, more than a quarter of all the oil produced from Drake's Well to 1941. American output rose 30%, calling on nearly all the reserve, even as Ix, promoted to Petroleum Administrator for war, envied Britain's unity. On any oil matter, the British government is a unit. Over here, everyone is in everyone else's hair. Stalin offered a toast that captured it. "This is a war of engines and octanes. I drink to the American auto industry and the American oil industry." A single American division used 45 times the horsepower of its First World War counterpart, and about half the tonnage shipped overseas was oil. Technical innovation mattered as much as volume. The humble 5-gallon jerry can, modeled on a captured German design and improved with a pouring spout, and above all 100-octane aviation gasoline, proven when it gave Spitfires the edge over Messerschmitts in the Battle of Britain. American output of it, aided by catalytic cracking, rose from under 40,000 barrels a day to over 500,000. Only once did fuel shortage check the Allies, and Yergin ends the chapter there. After the Normandy breakout, General George Patton's Third Army raced some 500 miles across France until the gasoline ran short, held up not by any absolute shortage, but by supplies stuck back in Normandy. The Allies having advanced 260 logistical planning days in just 21 days. "My men can eat their belts," Patton fumed, "but my tanks have got to have gas. Give me 400,000 gallons, he told Bradley, and I'll put you inside Germany in 2 days. Eisenhower, valuing Patton's ruthless driving power, but doubting his judgment, sent the fuel instead to the forces supporting Montgomery, and Patton was halted at the German border. 750,000 Allied casualties in liberating Western Europe fell after that September check. The military historian Basil Liddell Hart judged that the best chance of a quick finish was probably lost when the gas was turned off from Patton's tanks in the last week of August. Patton himself died in a car collision months later. Chapter 20. The New Center of Gravity. During and after the Second World War, Yergin writes, the strategic and geological center of gravity of world oil shifted decisively from the United States and the Caribbean toward the Middle East, and especially Saudi Arabia. The shift was announced by the eminent geologist Everett de Gaulier, discoverer in 1910, of the great Mexican well of the Golden Lane, a pioneer of the seismograph and a founder of what became Texas Instruments, sent by the American government in 1943 to appraise Persian Gulf oil. The center of gravity of world oil production, he reported, is shifting from the Gulf Caribbean area to the Middle East, to the Persian Gulf area, and is likely to continue to shift until it is firmly established in that area. A member of his mission put it more bluntly to the State Department. The oil in this region is the greatest single prize in all history. De Gaulier's team put the region's proven and probable reserves at some 25 billion barrels, with speculative figures running to hundreds of billions. The United States had produced almost 90% of Allied oil during the war, its high watermark as the world's supplier. That prize forced a reorientation of American policy. In 1940, the Middle East had produced less than 5% of world oil, against 63% for the United States, and Roosevelt had said Saudi Arabia was a little far afield for us, leaving the king's support to the British. The Arabs have the religion, it was said, but the Allies have the money. But wartime fear of domestic exhaustion, captured in Ix's 1943 article, "We're Running Out of Oil," which warned that America's crown, symbolizing supremacy as the oil empire of the world, is sliding down over one eye, bred a new conviction that the United States must control foreign, extraterritorial reserves. As one historian put it, the pencil came to an odd pause at one point and placed the Middle East. A series of ambitious government schemes followed: to buy a controlling stake in the company that would become Aramco, to build a government pipeline across Arabia, and to sign an Anglo-American petroleum agreement dividing the region's oil. Roosevelt sketched the division for the British ambassador on a hand-drawn map. Persian oil is yours, share Iraq and Kuwait, Saudi oil is ours. A wrangle about oil, Churchill cabled him anxiously, would be a poor prelude. Roosevelt reassured him, "We are not making sheep's eyes at your oil fields in Iraq or Iran." Every one of these government schemes failed, killed by the industry's righteous and fiery indignation, and by antitrust fears. When the companies were first offered a government partnership, they were stunned. They had, as one put it, gone fishing for a cod and had caught a whale. The Anglo-American Agreement, signed in 1944 and denounced by one British minister as a, quote, monster cartel, was twice withdrawn from the Senate and died by 1947, a State Department memo asking whether the thing was dangerous or useless, and whether to smother it or adopt it. But the diplomacy produced one enduring image. After the Yalta Conference in 1945, Roosevelt met Ibn Saud aboard the American cruiser Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake. The king arrived on a destroyer with a retinue of 48 and a flock of sheep, sleeping in a tent pitched on the deck, and Roosevelt gave him one of his own wheelchairs, which the anti-Zionist king, who suggested displaced Jews be settled in Germany, called his twin. Churchill hurried to meet the king 3 days later, and outclassed in gift-giving, presented a Rolls-Royce that cost the Treasury dearly. Roosevelt died that April. The post-war exhaustion scare faded, one oilman calling the shortage psychological rather than a geological condition, and Ike's was soon out. Solidification of the American position, Yergin writes, would now proceed not through Washington, but through private hands seeking their own salvation, even as the United States was about to become, for the first time, a net importer of oil. Chapter 21. The Post-War Petroleum Order. In the late 1940s, Yergin writes, the intersection of exploding demand, the Cold War, Marshall Plan reconstruction, and the vast Middle Eastern reserves produced a new post-war petroleum order centered on the Middle East. American gasoline rationing ended in 1945 with a cry of, "Fill up!" The number of American cars rose from 26 million in 1945 to 40 million in 1950, and gasoline sales were more than 40% higher, and in 1948 imports exceeded exports for the first time, so that the phrase foreign oil entered the language. A brief post-war shortage even drove more than 20 congressional investigations. Through 3 great deals, the majors solidified their positions. First, Aramco was enlarged. Standard of New Jersey and SoConey joined the original partners, Standard of California and Texaco, which faced an embarrassment of riches they could not finance or market alone. The newcomers escaped the old red line restriction through the doctrine of supervening illegality, over the furious resistance of the French and of Gulbenkian, who declared, "We do not acquiesce," and litigated from his Lisbon hotel through 4 non-communicating representatives, comparing the consortium to Raphael's School of Athens. The final structure diluted the Aramco shares, Jersey 30%, SoCal 30%, Texaco 30%, SoConey 10%, and the deal was signed on March 12, 1947, the same day Truman announced the Truman Doctrine of aid to Greece and Turkey. Second, Gulf, long on crude oil and short on markets, married its Kuwaiti oil to Shell, which was long on markets and short on crude oil, in a long-term purchase arrangement. Third, Anglo-Iranian signed 20-year contracts with Jersey and SoConey. The whole was shadowed by the Iranian crisis of 1946, the first great East-West confrontation of the Cold War, when Stalin, who told the American ambassador that the Baku fields were our major source of supply and very vulnerable, was forced to withdraw his troops from northern Iran. Above all, Middle Eastern oil now fueled Europe's recovery, after the brutal winter of 1946 and 1947, froze the Thames at Windsor, and halted British industry for 3 weeks, achieving, as one man said, what German bombing never had. As Yergin puts it, without petroleum, the Marshall Plan could not have functioned. About a fifth of Marshall Plan aid over 4 years went to buy oil, and Europe's supply swung from the Western Hemisphere to the Middle East, ending the last vestige of the old Achilles pricing, as Middle Eastern oil was pushed below the American Gulf benchmark. The great pipeline called TAP Line was pushed across the desert, its completion in 1950, replacing a 7,000-mile sea voyage around Arabia with a 1,000-mile overland route to Sidon in Lebanon. The proclamation of Israel in 1948 raised fears of an Arab oil cutoff, and the fiercely anti-Zionist Ibn Saud held a trump card, but he distinguished the commercial Aramco from American policy and did not use it, fearing his Hashemite rivals more than he feared the Jews. Britain's Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin summed up the new dependence. Without Middle Eastern oil, he said, there was no hope of our being able to achieve the standard of living at which we are aiming. Truman pledged American interest in Saudi Arabia's independence and territorial integrity, very nearly a guarantee, and the kingdom became what is probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment. Cheap foreign oil, meanwhile, killed off crash plans for synthetic fuels and shale, and, as offshore drilling and interstate natural gas surged at home, the age of American energy independence was over. A 1950 Jersey analysis already foresaw that Middle Eastern oil available to the company may exceed requirements substantially, a first hint of the coming surplus and the battles over dividing the profits. Chapter 22. 50-50. The New Deal in Oil. The post-war struggle between oil-producing landlord nations and the tenant companies, Yergin writes, was fundamentally a fight over the division of economic rents, and inseparably over power and pride. It produced the landmark 50-50 principle. He explains the idea through the economist David Ricardo, who had made a killing on Wellington's defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. The rent is what remains after production costs, transport, and a fair return on capital are subtracted from the market price. With Middle Eastern oil costing perhaps 25 cents a barrel to produce and selling for around $2.50, the rents were enormous, perhaps $1.65 a barrel, and 3 claimants wanted them: the host country, the company, and the consuming country's treasury. As the economist M.A. Edelman put it, this is the great divide of the petroleum industry. A rich discovery means a dissatisfied landlord. If he gets some, he wants more. Keynes had observed that practical men are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. The 50-50 principle was pioneered in Venezuela. After the dictator Gomez died, reformers of the generation of 28 inches demanded, in the words of the oil expert Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, the total purification of the Venezuelan oil industry, its ritual cleansing. A 50-50 split was enshrined in Venezuelan law in 1943, and government oil income multiplied sixfold by 1948. Pérez Alfonso even took royalties in kind and sold the oil himself, so that the veil of mystery was removed forever. Romulo Betancourt cautioned that to nationalize outright would have been a suicidal leap into space. The principle then spread to the Middle East, carried in part by a traveling Venezuelan delegation that translated its tax laws into Arabic. The mechanism in Saudi Arabia was ingenious: the American Foreign Tax Credit, a provision dating to 1918. A Saudi income tax on Aramco could be credited against the company's American tax bill, so Riyadh could double its stake from $39 million to $78 million. While Aramco's total burden stayed the same, the money simply flowed to Riyadh instead of Washington. The State Department, in the anxious atmosphere of the Korean War, embraced it. Since company retreat is inevitable, make the retreat as beneficial and orderly as possible. The Saudi 50-50 agreement was signed on December 30, 1950. By 1951, Saudi Arabia collected $110 million, while Aramco paid only $6 million to the U.S. Treasury. The chapter also introduces the newcomers who cracked open the old order, lured by the twin, and, Yergin notes, ultimately inconsistent American goals of faster development and lower consumer prices. Ralph Davies organized Ammon Oil to win the Kuwaiti neutral zone, its entree arranged by a Texas welder who had met the emir's secretary in a Cairo hotel and fixed the palace plumbing, and J. Paul Getty in the Saudi neutral zone, offered an extraordinary 55 cents a barrel royalty, far above anywhere else, after his geologist, flying over in a DC-3, spotted a promising mound and rated the odds 50-50. After 5 years, $30 million, and a string of dry holes, Getty struck oil in 1953. Fortune called the strike, quote, somewhere between colossal and history-making, and named Getty America's richest man and sole billionaire. Asked about it, he said, "If you can count your money, you don't have $1 billion. Gulbenkian, watching the independents bid up the terms, foresaw trouble. They offer fantastic terms to the local governments who expect similar fantasies from us. The result is trouble all around. I would not be tranquil." 50-50 spread across the region, to Kuwait, to Iraq, and one internal Jersey paper caught both the logic and the peril. There is something inherently satisfying in the 50-50 concept, it noted, but if we ever admit in any country that an equal division is less than fair, the ground will be cut out from under our feet in every country. 50-50 was also cheaper for Washington than fighting Congress for more foreign aid, and, the State Department reasoned, the retreat should be orderly. It was, one historian wrote, an economic and political watershed no less significant for the Middle East than the transfer of power for India and Pakistan. And within 6 months, events in neighboring Iran would show the landlord-tenant relationship was far from resolved. Chapter 23. Old Mossi and the Struggle for Iran. The Iranian oil crisis of the early 1950s, Yergin writes, marked a turning point in which the old foreign-owned concession gave way to a negotiated consortium. The United States replaced Britain as the dominant power in Middle Eastern oil, and Cold War logic became entangled with an antitrust oil cartel case at home. Iran seethed with hatred of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Between 1945 and 1950, the company's profits far exceeded Iran's royalties, and the British government itself took more in taxes from the company than Iran received altogether. The young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had been placed on the throne when Britain and Russia deposed his father in 1941 to secure the wartime supply line. The company's chairman, Sir William Fraser, resisted every change, a man of whom a Foreign Office minister said he had all the contempt of a Glasgow accountant for anything which cannot be shown on a balance sheet. Even the American diplomat George McGee thought the company and the British government guilty of the unusual and persistent stupidity of missing the moment. When the Saudi 50-50 made Fraser's terms untenable, Iranian nationalism boiled over. "The source of all the misfortunes of this tortured nation," declared Mohammad Mossadegh, "is only the oil company." In the spring of 1951, after the assassination of the Prime Minister Rosmara by a man on a sacred mission, the industry was nationalized and Mossadegh became premier. A sheep was sacrificed at the refinery gates. Yergin's portrait of Old Mossi is vivid. Nearly 70, bald, long-nosed, a great-grandson of a Shah, yet a mass-mobilizing reformer who received visitors in his pajamas from his bed and fainted for theatrical effect. Achilles called him a great actor and a great gambler. Eden said he was the first real bit of meat to come the way of the cartoonists since the war. The British ambassador thought him cunning and slippery and completely unscrupulous. The British drew up a plan, codenamed Plan Y, to seize the Abadan refinery by force, but the United States pressed hard against it, fearing that a British move south would invite a Soviet move north. Churchill thought the area more important than Korea. Instead, Britain imposed an embargo and economic warfare, and on October 4, 1951, its last staff sailed away aboard the cruiser Mauritius as the band played the Iranian anthem and then Colonel Bogey. The first of the great Middle Eastern oil concessions, Yergin writes, was also the first to be summarily canceled. The embargo removed Iranian oil during the Korean War, but the post-war boom absorbed the loss. Iran's production collapsed from 666,000 barrels a day to 20,000, while world output rose from 11 to 13 million. Mediation missions by Avril Harriman, whose interpreter ordered a copy of Alice in Wonderland as a guidebook, and by Richard Stokes, failed. Acheson interrupted Mossadegh's plea that Iran was just sand with the retort, "Yes, and with your oil, rather like Texas." Mossadegh, named Times Man of the Year, governed by decree, held a 99% plebiscite and drifted toward the Soviet-aligned Tudeh Party. Alarmed that Iran might fall to communism, and with it, John Foster Dulles warned, some 60% of the world's reserves. Churchill, back in office, and the Dulles brothers approved a covert overthrow, Operation Ajax, run in the field by the CIA's Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, with British help. Its theme song was, "Luck Be a Lady Tonight." After a tense reversal, in which the Shah briefly fled to Rome, nearly penniless, a pro-Shah crowd, tumblers, wrestlers, and weightlifters among them, carried the day on August 19, 1953, Mossadegh fled over his garden wall, and the young Shah returned to his throne, saying, "I knew that they loved me." Eisenhower wrote in his diary that it read more like a dime novel than an historical fact. The oil was brought back to market through a consortium designed to camouflage the old company. Anglo-Iranian, now renamed British Petroleum, held 40%, with Shell 14%, 5 American majors 8% each, the French 6%, and a group of independents the rest, the last insisted on by the American government. As one American negotiator, Howard Page, admitted, "If the U.S. and British governments hadn't really beat us on the head, we wouldn't have gone back." Fraser, meanwhile, won compensation that one Shell man called the best deal Willie Fraser ever made, since, quote, Anglo-Iranian actually had nothing to sell. It had already been nationalized. At home, an entangled antitrust oil cartel case shadowed all of this. A Federal Trade Commission report on the international cartel had been feared to aid Soviet propaganda, and Truman himself, a failed young wildcatter, called off the criminal suit, while Eisenhower reduced it to a civil one, the National Security Council deeming antitrust enforcement secondary to the national security interest. And the American diplomat Loy Henderson prophesied that the Middle Eastern countries, quote, will come together and decide upon unified policies which might have disastrous effects. The Shah was now, in Yergin's phrase, firmly ensconced on the peacock throne, moving toward the pretensions of an assertive monarch with global aspirations, while Mossadegh lived out his years under house arrest, experimenting with homeopathic medicine. Chapter 24. The Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis of 1956, Yergin writes, marked the moment when the canal shifted from being the highway of empire to the highway of oil, and when Britain's imperial pretensions collapsed. The canal, built by Ferdinand de Lesseps and opened in 1869, had been the lifeline of the British Empire, Disraeli buying Egypt's 44% stake with Rothschild money and telling Queen Victoria, "You have it, madam," until India became independent in 1948, dissolving its imperial rationale just as it acquired a new one. By 1955, petroleum was two-thirds of the canal's traffic, and two-thirds of Europe's oil passed through it. The crisis grew out of the Arab nationalism, embodied in Gamal Abdel Nasser, the post office clerk's son who had toppled King Farouk, mastered the radio through the Voice of the Arabs, and called the creation of Israel the greatest international crime. A CIA profile noted that he gets boyish pleasure out of conspiratorial doings. When the United States, weighing his Soviet bloc arms deals and his recognition of Red China, abruptly canceled a loan for the Aswan Dam on July 19, 1956, Nasser, on July 26, nationalized the canal, using de Lesseps as the code word for the army to seize it, then slipped off to watch a film. Britain and France saw him as a resurrected Mussolini or Hitler. The year was the 20th anniversary of Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland, and Eden had resigned in 1938 over appeasement, and for Britain oil was the jugular. Eden had warned the Soviet leaders that we would fight for it, rather than be strangled to death, with only 3 months reserves. In secret collusion with Israel, agreed at Sèvres, Britain and France launched an invasion in late October, even as Eden's health failed under painkillers and 106-degree fever. But President Eisenhower, weeks from re-election as a man of peace, refused to back his allies, judging that Nasser thrives on drama, and that British thinking was out of date. He would let them, he said, boil in their own oil, withholding emergency supplies while Nasser blocked the canal with scuttled ships filled with rocks and cement and old beer bottles. Syrian engineers sabotaged the pipeline, and Saudi Arabia embargoed Britain and France. Facing a run on the pound, an American refusal of IMF aid, the Americans treating Britain, one official said, as naughty boys, and no oil, Britain and France agreed to a humiliating ceasefire. Macmillan, told of the oil sanctions, said simply, "That finishes it." Dulles later asked the British Foreign Secretary, "Why didn't you go through with it and get Nasser down?" Only afterward did an emergency oil lift, drawing on Western Hemisphere supply and redeployed tankers, the Texas Railroad Commission having at first refused to raise output on the ground that England still treated America as a province or dominion, make up nearly 90% of the shortfall by the spring of 1957. The consequences were lasting. Eden resigned. The Times of London wrote that he was the last prime minister to believe Britain was a great power, and the first to confront a crisis which proved she was not. The crisis spurred the building of ever larger supertankers built in Japanese yards as the new answer to security of supply, and Macmillan, Eden's successor, who had read Pride and Prejudice before being summoned to the palace, called Middle East oil the biggest prize in the world, even as, years later, Eden, now Lord Avon, would pray at a dinner that the British might find a lake of oil under the North Sea. Chapter 25. The Elephants. From the early 1950s to the late 1960s, Yergin writes, the world oil market was overwhelmed by a surge in both consumption and even faster supply, driven by the giant Middle Eastern fields, the industry called elephants. Free world crude production rose from under 9 million barrels a day in 1948 to 42 million in 1972. The American share fell from 64% to 22%, while Middle Eastern production grew 15-fold. Proven reserves rose nearly 9-fold, from 62 billion barrels to 534 billion, more than 7 of every 10 new barrels lying in the Middle East, and the estimated life of reserves rose from 19 years to 35. It was, as the geologist de Gaulier had written, a world in which the problem becomes market rather than production. The surge shattered the old order and its sacrosanct 50-50 principle. The battering ram was the Italian Enrico Mattei, whom Yergin calls a new Napoleon, the son of a policeman who had left school at 14, led wartime partisans, built the state oil company ENI, owned a newspaper, and coined the mocking name the Seven Sisters for the majors. Excluded from the Iranian consortium, Mattei took revenge by negotiating in 1957 a deal that made Iran his partner and gave it 75% rather than 50%. As the British embassy in Tehran conceded, 50-50 is about as dead as the 4-minute mile. And, as inevitably, Japan's state-backed Arabian oil company, born of an idea hatched on an Italian train and Standard of Indiana, soon offered similar terms. The Shah lectured one American chairman, "You know, we are not Arabs, we are Aryans, and we are the same race as you are," and named his new field Darius. Meanwhile, Nasser rose after Suez, the transistor radio carrying his voice across the Arab world, and in 1958, a grisly coup destroyed the Iraqi monarchy. The young king beheaded, the strongman Nuri es-Said, disguised as a woman, lynched and flattened by a car. Two obscure but fateful men now took the stage. Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso of Venezuela, austere, almost monastic, who carried sardine sandwiches, kept a rusting old car as a shrine to the dangers of oil wealth, and had studied the Texas Railroad Commission in the Library of Congress, sought conservation, a higher government share, and an international prorationing system on the Texas model, complaining that American import quotas were throwing us the bones. And Abdullah Tariki of Saudi Arabia, the Red Sheikh, son of a camel owner and a graduate of the University of Texas, where he had been mistaken for a Mexican and barred from bars, held that oil was the strongest of weapons the Arabs wield. The catalyst was the widening gap between the falling market price and the posted price on which government revenue was figured. When the majors quietly cut the posted price, the governments felt robbed, since they absorbed none of the cut while the companies did. The Soviet Union, its output doubling as the Volga-Urals fields came in, re-entered world markets and displaced Venezuela as the second-largest producer, a quite dangerous situation. The CIA warned, and BP made the first posted price cut of some 10% in early 1959. At the Arab Oil Congress in Cairo that April, the influential journalist Wanda Jablonski, the most influential oil journalist of her time, Czech-born and the matchmaker of the peace, introduced Tariki to Pérez Alfonso. "There's another guy," she said, "who's just as nuts as you." In secret meetings at a Cairo yacht club, described by one participant as a James Bond atmosphere, they forged a gentleman's agreement to defend the price structure, create national oil companies, and move toward a larger 60-40 government share. It was, Yergin writes, the first real step toward OPEC.